All right, up next is the moral dimensions of Open Group. Oh, I was just checking to see.
Okay, show them how it's done.
Can you be my clicker, Mike?
Yeah.
When you see me move it?
Oh, that's not connected.
No, it's not connected.
Okay, that's fine.
Is that okay?
Is our group has shrunk?
What?
Survivors.
Forget the scale. We're all like, be moral.
So because of illness.
Okay. I am Cheryl Ball. I'm presenting again for the Moral Dimensions group, and this is the rest of the group. Where's
everyone?
the mic? Oh.
Mike Taylor, agent provocateur.
T. Godotti, the devil's advocate.
Susanne Feldsman, Academy of Science of South Africa, Scholarly Publishing.
John Walensky, Too Far Bossy.
Karina Solavere, Latin American School of Social Sciences.
Thank you. We've had some illnesses and some otherwise scheduled conference calls this morning for the rest of our team. Okay. Oh, it would help if I actually... We released our inner Krakens on the issue of morality in making scholarship open. The Kraken represents for us sort of a dual notion, both in going after something that we felt very strongly about, but also in the clash of the titans on this panel dissenting about some of these issues. We started with the question of who has the moral obligation to enact open access. The determination? Everyone. Not just from the top down, but from the bottom up, from faculty and from users and from disciplines, as much as it is from publishers and institutions and society. Now I'm going to hold off on the movie posters for the rest of the presentation so that we can focus on the issues that we have at hand. Ultimately, we want to improve the human condition. We want to open scholarly research to all. Within the group, we felt that we were morally compelled to advance open access for scholarly publications and data in many cases. Everyone on the planet needs access to scholarly research, and moving us towards global openness benefits all sides of discourses and all economies. But why is research considered a public good, or should be considered a public good? Well, research saves lives. If we embargo it for too long, we act immorally. And this is not just true of sciences, but of social sciences and the humanities. As a humanist and a rhetorician myself, I only half facetiously use #AllResearchMatters here. Yes, cancer research saves lives, literally, but so does research on critical race theory and race rhetorics. So then by what means can we reach that high moral ground with open scholarship? Our first bullet point here was quite contested within the group. With intellectual property law, we do need to work to advance its contribution to the public good by changing it for the better. And that means interacting with the law and speaking on panels when we're called to do so that we can forward our agenda for the public good. For privacy, we must attend to both individual and societal privacy protocols, such as those of indigenous populations, who may, for instance, Kristen, what is her new last name? I can't remember, working with indigenous populations on the West Coast. From her, I've learned that after an elder dies in certain communities, their information is no longer allowed to be made public in the same way that it was when they were still living. And we must attend and respect that privacy. We must also remember that not every stakeholder within a community represents its group. and we must treat each other kindly and apologize. I wrote a bad word in here, sorry. We must apologize when we screw up.
That is not what it says.
I apologize. And again, going back to my roots as a rhetorician and Aristotle's view that we must persuade using all available means. For us, in this era, we have digital technology. And through digital technology, we can enact this public good by creating additional value out of thin air, as Mike Taylor, our resident provocateur, said during our meeting yesterday. Again, some of these issues were contested in the group, but what we all agree on is that the contestation pushes all of us stakeholders in the group to recognize the urgency of this change. There are two moral dimensions of open access publishing that we discussed with firmity in the group. The first is transparency. Evaluating how transparent each of these issues are, for instance, in relation to the openness score that another group mentioned, will help stakeholders of all types determine how well their research processes and products are meeting this moral obligation to create public good. For instance, some of the questions that we might ask around this issue of transparency is, how much of a researcher's budget is going to APCs? How do the economic models of journals have global impacts? How open are our methods and data so that we can validate results and not duplicate studies within and across disciplines? For instance, Linus's law of software says, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. How can we implement that within our work? How rigorous and open is our peer review? And how internationally open, welcoming, and available are our publications really? Our draft report, of course, in this moment of transparency is still online for commenting at the URL on the slide. Research stakeholders also have a moral and ethical obligation to budget appropriately to make data and publications fair. We want to highlight the budget part as it comes at the beginning of a research project when stakeholders must budget time and money for data management and the open and universally accessible use of research publications. And I want to just mention for a moment this relationship between open access, accessibility for users of all needs, and preservation. These are joint things. In many countries, of course, being fair is required by law. And this means that users too, whether they are scholars, journalists, or my hypochondriac great Aunt Sarah, have a moral and ethical obligation to cite published research in whatever manner is appropriate. So in sum, the action items proposed by the Moral Dimensions Group are less based in deliverables and more in human kindness. It is all our responsibility. Thank you.
All
right.
6 minutes as well.
Good job. Oh, good.
Unbelievable.
The Who Decides group is up next.
Moral support. Moral support, always welcome. Morning. I guess it's still morning. I'm Ivy Anderson from the California Digital Library, and I will invite my colleagues to introduce themselves.
John Vaughan, Association of American Universities.
Ralf Schimmer, Max Planck Digital Library.
Ian, National University of Singapore.
Salvatore Mele, CERN and Scope 3.
Joan Lippincott, Coalition for Networked Information, CNI.
And Debbie Stein, Carnegie Mellon University.
And Mel Desart, University, not Ann, but next to Ann. Mel Desart, University of Washington, Ann.
And sorry, Rémi Gaillard from Paris, UPMC University.
So, oh, I have to do both of these. So our group was Who Decides, and as you'll see, we talked about not only who decides, but who decides what, because you can't have a decider without a what. So we started out in our group by talking about identifying the stakeholders that have power to act in specific ways in the scholarly communication ecosystem. And many of these stakeholders have been outlined in other presentations already today and yesterday. So this graphic is a representative list. One thing missing in the chart, but in our framework are learned societies, for example. So there are a few more stakeholders than you may see in this particular graphic. We also wanted to identify the source of each stakeholder's power, because the nature of each actor's power determines the kind of actions that it can take. So funding agencies, for example, have the power of money, the power to make policy. Libraries have the power of money, as well as the power of choice, that is, the ability to choose what to invest in. Universities have the power of policy making. Publishers, including societies as publishers, have the power conveyed by ownership of intellectual property and journal brand. Researchers have the power of choosing what and where to publish. We also recognize, and this was a comment yesterday, that the public is also an important stakeholder and may have a participatory role in any initiatives that go forward, and indeed often will have that role. But the public's ability to directly exercise power in this domain is limited, and so the public does not figure as a decider in most of our scenarios. Oh. Thank you. So multiple stakeholders, as we discussed various scenarios, we realized that, as other groups have said, just about any action will involve multiple stakeholders. And so in contemplating the need for multiple stakeholders to cooperate in any significant transformation, we realize that these actions generally require a convening authority to bring stakeholders together, and I think we've heard some of that also in some of the discussions we've already heard today. So there are many organizations in our community that have the legitimacy that gives them that kind of convening power. So professional associations, for example, professional associations of libraries, of universities, of learned societies that may exist on a national or a global level. So in the library domain in the US, it might be ARL or ACRL. In France, for example, there's ADBU as a library organization at the national level. Similarly, universities, AAU, APLU, again in France, CPE would be an example. So there are many organizations that we can look to that can exercise this kind of convening power and authority. Also, funders have convening authority and power. Standards organizations have convening power for standards work. Intergovernmental organizations may have a similar convening ability. And independent organizations can also exercise a convening power if they have sufficient status within a particular community. And there are many innovative initiatives that emerge within particular communities, which then attract additional support. So really any stakeholder can position itself as a convening power if it can command the kind of authority. Some organizations by virtue of their nature as organizations, and others by virtue of their ability to act and their willingness to act. So in discussing then what kinds of actions the deciders might decide and take, we determined that we had a couple of key goals that we wanted to focus on. And so we talked about two primary goals, one for the journal literature, an economically feasible, sustainable move to open access, preserving quality and ensuring preservation and access. And then more broadly for scholarship generally, the second goal is a somewhat more capacious goal that reflects a desire to enable new forms of knowledge creation to flourish. So we did our own sticky note exercises and identified quite a few scenarios of actions that different the stakeholders could take to drive change. But we coalesced around three specific different proposals to facilitate and drive change. The first one is evaluation of research outputs, so looking at ways to modernize the criteria for tenure and promotion within the academy. Secondly, nurturing alternative publishing models. And thirdly, a global flip of the journal literature to open access. So that third one is very squarely aimed at that first goal of an open, sustainable journal literature. All three of these proposals address that, but the first two also also address other kinds of knowledge creation and more transformative initiatives. So for research evaluation, the proposition is that universities and research communities, in this case both learned societies and individual researchers, might be convened by a professional association to exercise, through the exercise of policy and of choice, create new evaluation criteria that fairly consider open access, that recognize and validate alternative metrics, whether those are at the article level, or alternatives in other kinds of ways and other kinds of domains. Reward more openness, such as making research data open, making versions of articles that are submitted for evaluation open, and one of the mechanisms for doing that might be to reward deposit in open access repositories. So examples of this kind of activity might be the MLA guidelines that have been recently issued for evaluating digital humanities work, the San Francisco DORA principles, as I think we talked about yesterday. So our second proposal involves cultivating alternative models of publication. These can be of a couple of different flavors. One might be to support lower cost dissemination platforms for traditional research publication. Another type of alternative model might be to support more transformative initiatives that serve as an outlet for newer forms of research. So in this scenario, libraries as funders, publishers, including but not limited to society publishers, both as owners of intellectual property and also as owners of service provision infrastructure, as well as research communities as knowledge creators who exercise choice in disseminating their scholarly work, come together to develop, support, and utilize alternative modes of dissemination, ideally operating at a lower cost than legacy infrastructure. So these are models that might be most likely to emerge through independent action of interested stakeholders, often with a disciplinary focus rather than a top-down approach through an organized society of some sort. So examples in this domain might be of initiatives that already exist, might be the Open Library of the Humanities, which is providing an efficient low-cost platform for open access journals funded by libraries. LingOA, which is an initiative by the linguistics community to transition linguistics journals to the Open Library of Humanities platform. And then Libraria, a collective of social science journals and learned societies that have teamed with the Public Knowledge Project to explore cooperative funding models. Our third example is a global flip. And by global flip, we're talking about converting the existing journal literature to open access in a large-scale way. And in this, I think I'm looking at the wrong, sorry. So in this model, libraries, publishers, and funders convened by an organization with global standing might come together to commit to redirect subscription funding toward open access publication in the existing journal literature. So examples of this might be Scope 3, which has established a global funding consortium of libraries and research funders under the auspices of CERN to convert a significant portion of the high-energy physics literature to open access. There are a number of so-called offsetting pilot agreements in Europe in which, for a single license fee, institutions are converting the output of their institution to open access within the context of a large-scale journals license with a publisher. And then there's another example is the OSI2016 initiative that's recently been launched by the Max Planck Society to solicit formal expressions of interest, whereby libraries on an individual or preferably a country level might publicly declare their intention to migrate from subscriptions to open access, utilizing models such as the offsetting model, such as investing in alternatives of other sorts. So these are the kinds of initiatives that we were thinking about. We wanted to give a bit of a flavor of how might this actually happen? What steps could these communities and conveners actually take to move these initiatives forward? So the first example is in research evaluation. Sorry. Oh, okay. So this activity is something that we think might best be conducted on a national scale rather than an international scale, because different countries have different mechanisms and different evaluation frameworks for research evaluation. So, for example, in the U.S., national professional associations, university associations, I should say, so AAU and APLU, for example, might be examples, might convene a range of key stakeholders to discuss options for research evaluation that could result in charging a task force, which might then conduct an environmental scan of alternative metrics initiatives that already exist and propose a roadmap for future action. So there's an actual sequence of actions that we think these stakeholders could take to develop a coherent program to move this desire that has been expressed today in many, many different forms and move that forward in a coherent way. Similarly, the example of a global flip. In this case, again, we have the recent example of the Max Planck OA2020 initiative, but other organizations could equally convene a conversation or a meeting among stakeholders, particularly organizations that have a global reach, such as the nascent Global Network of Research-Intensive Universities, which is a coalition of university associations across the globe. So such a convening organization might convene a meeting of interested stakeholders to formulate an initiative to transform subscriptions to open access. Institutions and other stakeholders would pledge their interest in order to build support and demonstrate support in critical mass. This initiative could also offer an analytical capability to help institutions at the institutional level or at the country level, perhaps, analyze subscription expenditures and publishing output to help institutions, and also library consortia might be a target for this, to help them assess the feasibility of such a move by analyzing both their subscription expenditures and the publication output of their institutions. So I believe the Max Planck Digital Library is offering this kind of analytical capability to other interested parties. And the University of California, our Pay It Forward project, which some of you have heard about, is also developing tools to facilitate this kind of analysis. And then armed with this kind of information, libraries and library consortia might enter into offsetting deals with major publishers, working together to outline migration paths, develop best practices, while avoiding restraint of trade, but still developing the practices that would lead to ultimately a converted system in an orderly way. So these are just, again, some of our ideas for how to move these kinds of initiatives forward. And we think that by concerted action among stakeholders, understanding what their agency is in particular contexts, one could develop a program of moving this kind of work forward. So with that, I would like to thank my wonderful, estimable colleagues. We had an extremely collegial and productive set of discussions, and I think we all benefited and were educated by the process. Thank you.